Hello and welcome to Full Chat, the weekly F1 news and discussion show with overwhelmingly negative reviews in the Netherlands. I'm Brad Philpot, and as always, I've done my best to scrape the motorsport barrel for some winter F1 content, and we hope you'll add your views and join in the discussion on our live YouTube chat. Remember, any super chat questions get a guaranteed answer, but even if you're a cheapskate and don't pay us any money, we'll probably answer you anyway. Joining me, as always, a former semi-decent go-kart racer who puts the nan in Fernando, my co-host and best mate, Alex Van Geen. How's it going, Alex?
That's painfully true. You know,
you are getting old.
My cart lid sits up here. For anyone who isn't on the YouTube, I'm pointing above my shoulder to see my beautiful blue and red helmet that a friend of mine painted for me that I haven't worn in a really depressing long time, and I hardly fit in a go-kart these days. So let's talk about more exciting things like the news that is going on in F1 these days.
Well, before we talk about that, let's tell everyone that we are now not a podcast. We are now a podcast. And that means that when I forgot to bring your image in, when I announced that you were here, no one on the podcast will have known that except I just mentioned it. So we're very excited about the fact that we are a proper podcast on all the different podcatchers. And actually, quite a few people downloaded us this last week.
Yeah, over 250 downloads. There was a whole bunch of watches on the YouTube, whole bunch of listens back to your Twitter space. It was like 1,500 views in total, which is, for a first week, when we have had nothing but technical problems, we changed the date and the time without telling anybody, it ain't too bad.
I was happy with those numbers, and I think we're going to grow. So before we get going, just a quick reminder, if you are joining us on the Twitter space, and I see there's quite a few people in there now, if you want to get involved in the chat, head to YouTube. The link is in my Twitter profile. It's also the last tweet I tweeted, or you can just search my name, Brad Philpot, on YouTube. So tonight's topics, we're going to talk about the potential of some new teams entering Formula One, what we think about expanding the grid, and how the most likely new entrant, Andretti Cadillac, will fare or not fare if they don't arrive. We're also going to remember some of the more recent newbies and discuss why they're no longer with us. And finally, we're going to take a look at the ill-fated Lola entry from 1997, which promised so much and delivered so little. So why don't we start off with the news of Formula One formally opening a process for new teams to submit their entry requests. So this came out, this news, was it a couple of weeks ago now? We've had some time to digest that. And this was, it was kind of all about Andretti, wasn't it? Because they're the team that have been making noise for months, maybe a year or more, that they really want a place on the grid. And they haven't been given one yet.
No, they haven't. And unfortunately, it seems like the person leading the charge on trying to tell F1 that they don't need any more new teams is Toto Wolff. I think it's more because they don't want to dilute the money fund. What a surprise. Something in F1 is led by money. But I actually think the added value that Andretti could bring, along with if they manage to bring an engine manufacturer with them, someone like Cadillac, I think that will well be worth it. Especially, could you imagine an American team with an American engine, 2 American drivers? The eyes that would come to Formula One from America just because of that would be enormous. So I think it's massive oversight from Toto. I think Toto maybe doesn't want any more competition, considering how far they slipped down the order last year.
So this is the thing, isn't it? You have a finite amount of money that's then split between the teams, and on the face of it, if you add an extra team, you're diluting that money, you're splitting it between more teams, so you can understand some teams not wanting an extra team. From a viewer's point of view, certainly those of us who have been around long enough to know Formula One with extra teams, you know, I think probably the maximum I've watched Formula One with is maybe 26 cars on the grid. We appreciate that those back markers, even if they're pretty rubbish, they do add something to the grid. At the very least, they bring extra seats for more drivers to have a shot that might not have had a shot before. So the basics are teams like maybe Toto heading Mercedes don't want to split the money up anymore. But that's not all there is to.
No. And also when you talk about when some of the other teams came in and they were a bit rubbish, like Marussia, like Caterham, like who's the other one I'm missing? HRT. When those 3 came in, I was actually invested in their battle. Who would win between those 3 and who would get a point? And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it was quite a good battle between those 3 because those 3 were quite close. It always had some young, exciting drivers in it, or pay drivers. But I also think they didn't fail because they weren't good teams. They failed because Formula One drew them in on false pretenses and then sold them down the river. You know, they brought them in originally saying that they'd have that F1 would go to a $30 million a year budget, then very quickly up that to 40 million, and then it never happened. And what a surprise, the teams that came in based on that budget didn't survive. And it affected Williams as well, because Williams bought into the fact that that's where the budget was going. That's how they organised their team, and they have suffered ever since.
So I don't think there's a lot of negativity from fans towards there being extra teams. I don't think any of us or many of us really are against that. From my point of view, I really want more. I think 20 cars on the grid just feels a little bit empty, and I think it should really be a minimum of 22 cars, and ideally for me, I think the number is 24. However, it's not quite as simple as the pot would just be split between more teams, because bringing in a good new team, particularly, as you mentioned, an all-American team, American engine manufacturer eventually, but certainly with the support of an American engine manufacturer, a couple of American drivers probably, or at least one, the pot gets bigger. It's not just you have this finite amount of money to split that then is a smaller portion everyone gets. It becomes a bigger pot of money. And that's, I think, what the new teams, Andretti in this case, will have to demonstrate to be taken super seriously or to get enough agreement. But as you mentioned, and as a couple of people have mentioned in the chat there's also a 200 million anti-dilution fund. And I assume that's dollars, $200 million, which will be a one-off payment split between the teams to kind of make up for the fact that they're having to split that pot further. So there are some measures put in place to mitigate the negative sides of having extra teams.
And they are considering putting that anti-dilution fund up to 300 million. And the thing is even with that money, it isn't putting Andretti off. And Andretti have been a massive motorsport team for decades. They've done very, very well in the sports that they do. And if they can partner with somebody like Cadillac, and I don't know if you've heard it, Brad, have you heard the Cadillac hybrid prototype car? Have you heard how incredible that thing sounds?
No, but race cars do sound good in general.
Race cars do sound good. Despite that people think that this generation of V6 turbos don't sound good, they're still very loud and still sound very good. I like the throaty whistle noise that you get from the turbo. But the other thing I think with it as well is, why are we asking Toto Wolff's opinion? Why are we asking any of the team's opinions on having new teams? It has absolutely nothing to do with them from a business point of view. It has their own business in mind, but that's not what F1 is in it for. If F1 was in it for their own business kind of mind, they probably would have not put a budget cap in. The budget cap in was for F1 to manage itself. So I think letting Andretti come in will open up so many different avenues for this sport to grow. And if it doesn't happen, I'll be disappointed.
So Andretti in particular are a very serious organisation. So you've got a team that is headed up by a former Formula One driver, and obviously, if we go a generation further back, a former Formula One world champion. They have IndyCar teams. They are a serious, modern, experienced racing outfit who should have been probably taken quite seriously up until now anyway, and now with the backing of it's Cadillac, but it's GM, it's General Motors, so it's one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. The Cadillac brand obviously is the one that they have chosen to make public, but as a manufacturer, as an entity, GM is obviously huge. They have to be being taken seriously now, and I think that's why you've probably seen a switch in attitude from the FIA. Ben Sulayem seemingly supportive now in the things I've seen in media in the last week or so. It looks like the FIA are on the side of Andretti, at least in principle. And I didn't really get that feeling before. Up until now, it felt like it was a bit cold. Everyone was cold to the idea of extra teams. So I'm encouraged, and I don't think this is remotely like the HRT, Marussia or Manor or whatever they ended up being called, Virgin, Caterham, Lotus issue. I mentioned loads of teams there, but that was actually only 3, just with loads of different names. It's not remote. Oh, even HRT weren't originally called HRT, were they? They were called Campos originally. Even that changed before they came in.
Who was USF1
and
USF1 was a big team as well. But
yeah,
when we think about teams that have come and gone, even teams with big budgets, we had Toyota. Toyota allegedly had a bigger budget than Ferrari and who was top at the time, Ferrari and McLaren and Red Bull. Toyota were a proper serious outfit. Their German facility that some of the teams still use. What was it called, Brad?
So
the facility that Toyota used to use in Stuttgart.
Was it not in Cologne?
Cologne, that's the one I was talking
Sorry,
about.
I was busy pressing buttons and
reading the chat.
Didn't have enough fingers to talk myself.
There we go. Connor, of course, Connor Edwards in the chat has instantly come in saying it's Cologne. But yeah, so it's somewhere in Germany, whatever. And it's an amazing world-class facility, but they couldn't make it work. BMW came in and basically did what what Audi are going to do with Sauber. They came in, they stuck one of their engines in a Sauber, called the team BMW, and that is basically what Audi are going to do. But the difference with Audi coming in is Audi have basically written the engine regs for themselves. So imagine if they turn up and they fumble it.
So being called full chat, we should probably reference the chat more than we have done so far. So I'm just going to pick out a couple of comments. Built to Jay-Z Lexus, who's always talkative in the chat, reckons that unfortunately adding teams would add zero value to Formula One. The best way to add value is to get the cars closer. I don't disagree with that, but I think that's something that's already underway. So I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. And we also have Connor saying that Toto Wolff might not like the Andretti proposal because Cadillac is Mercedes' rival in America. So like kind of luxury sedan. Okay, so that's something I've not really thought about, but yeah, maybe.
The Cadillac stuff is rumor anyway. We assume, well, we would like to assume that if Andretti is coming, that they would bring a manufacturer with them. What?
This just in, Alex is wrong about a thing. No, Andretti have announced officially that they're partnering with Cadillac. It's all part of their official announcement. So that is kind of like the known news. That's okay. God, that's actually one of the first times you've said a wrong thing on Full Chat.
I know.
So
We've done quite a lot of shows. One podcast, but a lot of shows.
And if I'm wrong about that, then someone tell me in the chat, but I'm quite confident. Tom in the chat, no surname for Tom, nice and under the radar. He mentioned Stefan GP. Do you remember Stefan GP? Another team that was proposed and really wanted an entry but couldn't get one. And this is this is before our current budget cap era. Formula One now is something people want to get into because you can actually make money from Formula One if you do it right. In the past, it was almost a guaranteed fail.
You've also got DGM who's saying, genuine question, why do people actually want more teams? I want more teams because it adds another element, because more teams, more racing, especially if the teams at the front aren't super close, it means you have much more of a midfield battle. I mean, everyone has talked about this season or last season not being that close. It only wasn't that close because Red Bull did such a good job. Look back to Austria. In Austria, we saw 5 different cars fighting over multiple corners, over multiple laps, with positions changing all the time. That's the closest I've ever seen F1. And that's the first year of these regulations. They are going to get closer and closer and closer and closer until we get to 2026, where they fuck it all up and change it all again, and then somebody else stretches their legs at the front.
So I'm going to give my answer to that exact same question. Why do people want more teams? And that is actually a really good question, because a lot of people will only have known Formula One with the current or similar set of 10 teams. Now, most race series in the world have more than 20 cars on the grid. I think I'm safe in saying most. Certainly, look at things like IndyCar and pretty much every feeder series, unless it's a struggling feeder series, they generally have more than 20 cars. And from my point of view, the reason I want Formula One to have more is probably similar to everything you've just said there. It's just more storylines. It's more things to watch. It's another few drivers on the grid. It's more seats that mean that drivers don't get to Formula 2 and do well and then end up having to just go off and do endurance racing. It's just more intrigue, more storylines, more things to watch. And I've always enjoyed, even if the teams are rubbish, and I don't think nowadays that's really a danger. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the show about some of the failures of the past and why they were failures, and one big one in particular. But nowadays, that isn't the way Formula One's set up. The regulations are restrictive to a point, and obviously the budget now is restrictive to a point where it's designed for teams to be able to be at least similar, not be off the back of the grid as they were in the past. So that's my answer.
So DGM, who asked that question, also says with less cars, it surely maintains its eliteness. I understand where he's coming from that, but having 10 teams versus having 12 teams doesn't dilute it any further. You know, you look at things like the Premiership, you know, there's 24 teams in the Premiership, and then they fight against a million other teams. It doesn't stop Lionel Messi still being named as the greatest player of all time, because he's in a bigger pool. If anything, it makes you look better.
Yeah, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing. Having more teams, it means you're beating more teams when you win. Beating just 9 other teams actually seems a bit lame to me, just based on my other motorsport experience. So anyway, to answer another question, Paul Handley in the chat asks, is Full Chat F1 a podcast on Apple Podcasts? It's a podcast on every podcatcher, unless it's an obscure one that I couldn't find. So we should be everywhere now. It took a little while to get that to happen, but
because we're on Acast, and Acast get to absolutely everything, which is great, which is how I was able to track the numbers obsessively throughout the week. Hopefully I'll get a few more this week.
So if you are listening on the Twitter space, just a reminder, listen back on a proper podcast if you want to. If this is a bit boring and you want to be able to just drive to work and listen to us, or if you want to chat to us, come onto the YouTube channel right now. So, Alex, we were going to look at a couple of specific examples of teams that have tried to get into Formula One in the recent past, in living memory, and kind of discuss why they didn't make it. So, the 3 that you named earlier, the 3 that came in 2010, there are actually 4 new teams in 2010, but I'll touch upon the 4th one in a moment because they did slightly better. 3 brand new teams were HRT, which was Hispania Racing Team. They were the grey-looking car that I actually really liked the look of. They later were white and red, I believe. You also had Caterham, but it was Lotus to begin with, and that's a confusing story in its own right, because there were 2 Lotuses on the grid that were completely separate teams.
Lotus, and Caterham, and 2 of them were owned by the same business. It didn't make any sense.
And you also had Marussia /Virgin /Manor, and they were the 3. And as you mentioned, they were all promised a budget cap, which was lower than the current budget cap, and that never appeared. And so they found themselves having committed to a series where the budgets were unrestricted and they're fighting against all the manufacturers that we know and love. And they had planned to come in and only need a great deal less money than that. And Connor, as always, hits the nail on the head in the chat. It was Mercedes were the 4th team that I was alluding to that came in 2010. So having taken over from Brawn. So why did they do badly? So we know the budget cap never happened. Why else did they do badly? I'm going to suggest one thing. Low amount of prep time. So that's never a good thing. Undercooked cars. Did we have a regulation change? Oh, we had a regulation change the year before, didn't we? The 2009 regs were completely different to previously. So it was the 2nd year, I guess, of that particular regulation set. Any other reasons that you can think of why they were crap?
They were just massively underprepared and underfunded. And I'm trying to think to the driver lineups. So we had, in HRT, we had Narain Karthikeyan. I'm not going to be able to get all of these.
I can't remember.
Yeah,
you're probably right.
We had Narain Karthikeyan. Who else did we have? We had Danny Ricciardo. He wasn't straight away.
Wait, Karun Chandok definitely drove a race or 2, didn't he?
Yeah, Karun Chandok did like 4 or 5 races, I think.
Did he drive in the Lotus? I honestly can't remember.
He was in the Lotus. Heikki Kovalainen was in the Lotus.
Daniel Ricciardo even drove for HRT.
Yeah.
That was his first team.
Italian driver, Trulli. Trulli drove for one of them.
Yes. Now, that was one of the things I was going to mention. The Lotus team that ultimately became Caterham, they were a little bit better prepared /funded. They had proper drivers, experienced drivers that weren't just there. In fact, part of their problem was that they were paying their drivers a proper salary. They had Jarno Trulli and Heikki Kovalainen, who were experienced.
For those who don't know, Jarno Trulli was a teammate of Fernando Alonso's for a long time. And Jarno Trulli, despite being given the name the Trulli train through most races because he just used to be not very fast in races and had lots of people behind him, he was an exceptional qualifier. And that was part of the reason the Trulli train came, because he would qualify very high up the grid, matching the great Fernando Alonso, but would then fall back in the race due to his race pace. So he was a proper peddler, and Heikki Kovalainen, hung around and was near enough to Lewis Hamilton. So
Not
they
really.
come on, let's give him something. He
He wasn't
outqualified
hopeless.
him in Silverstone 2008.
He wasn't completely hopeless. Anyway, my point with them was that they were at least professional, experienced drivers. And then you had newer people. You had Lucas de Grassi in the Virgin, Glock as well. I'm not even going to mention this person's name, otherwise we're going to mention this person all the time in the chat. But we're being helped out by our chat room as always. Anyway, we've mentioned all those. Bruno Senna was the last one, I think, with the
Who did
HRT.
he drive for HRT?
With HRT. I actually was a big fan of that team. I always liked the real underdog, and they were the worst.
They were terrible. The thing is, was also none of them did any testing. I think they all turned up to like the final day of the last test or something. Actually, no, I'm pretty certain HRT's first laps were like in second practice or something of the first race, and to have that at Australia is horrendous.
Yeah, the teams, certainly, at least one of the teams, were building the cars for the first time in the pit garages at the first race. That's the level of unpreparedness we're talking about. So anyway, ultimately, these all fell by the wayside, and we don't have any of them left, do we? They all tried, and then ultimately just disappeared off the grid. And ever since then, we've kind of been running with a couple of teams down. And that's how it's felt to me anyway. I never was too against the fact that they were that slow either, because eventually, given time, they probably would have got better. But anyway, there were some teams that have come in that have done quite well. Haas have been probably the most respectable of recent years, would you say, as like a completely new entrant? They came in with a very different philosophy, buying so much of their car from another team, which I think, and obviously they're very well funded too, and a very experienced American race team.
Isn't it also, so they buy lots of their parts from Ferrari, and isn't their chassis a Dallara chassis as well?
I think less and less so, but yes, still predominantly and in the past entirely a Dallara chassis.
Yeah. My issue with Haas has always been a case of they look really, really promising for like the first 5 races. They score points. They're really, really good. I remember those first few seasons with Grosjean and K-Mag, you know, they were just outside the podium positions. And then they had those 2 races where, in Australia, where the wheels literally fell off their wagon and cost them so much. I mean, that was probably like position costing, money costing for the whole season, just those 2 failures across those 2 races. But yeah, I wish that if Haas can produce out of the first 5 races over the rest of the season, they'll actually be a decent force and can fight with the likes of AlphaTauri, but they seem to run out of puff. It's like someone who's doing a marathon and goes sprinting over the first few furlongs.
With all of these teams, all of our current teams, I think given a few years with the way we've got not just the budget cap, but also the way the resources and the wind tunnel time are skewed, you know, less and less time, the more successful you are. Hopefully we're going to see just more of a natural bunching. I say natural, it's artificial in as much as you're not allowed to spend anything you want, but natural in as much as we're not putting any kind of physical limit on the teams other than the amount of money or wind tunnel time that they're allowed to spend. Speaking of wind tunnel, one of the new teams that we mentioned, I say new, you know, back in 2010 it was new, never saw a wind tunnel because the Virgin's whole concept was that it was entirely designed by CFD. Do you remember that?
I do, and I remember it caused quite a stir. Everyone was like, how can they do that? All computers, blah, blah, blah. And they were right because the car was rubbish.
Yeah, so they were right because the car was rubbish, but I think some of the claims with it would be unsafe, and it just wasn't competitive. But fundamentally, it wasn't a whole lot different to the other new teams. They were all much of a muchness, and I think it was still quicker than the HRT. But another car which never saw a wind tunnel is the one in my story coming up in just a moment. So
I'm very interested in hearing about your story because I don't know this story and I've purposely got you not to tell me anything about it. So me and the audience can all learn about Lola together. But, you know, it's as far as with regards to the story about new teams, it would just be nice to inject not only new teams, new names, new engine manufacturers. It'd also be a really good way to inject more decent drivers. You know,
Yes.
there is such a massive pool of racing drivers, and if we can extend the pool of F1 teams, extend the pool. Actually, how many teams are in F2 and F3?
I don't know. Someone in the chat will know. I'm not even going to guess. But one thing I was just going to say was, especially we need to extend the driver pool when we've got drivers staying on into their older age. When you've got Alonso and Hamilton sticking around, pushing or going over 40, then yeah, you do need more opportunities. Otherwise, drivers will just never get to Formula One. They'll have a whole crop of drivers that will kind of get to Formula One and then fall by the wayside because there's literally nowhere to go. Yeah. You can't be in a test and development role forever. So that's another reason why I'd advocate.
For me, my biggest person that missed out on Formula One and got robbed of their chance is Stoffel Vandoorne. Stoffel Vandoorne dominated absolutely everything that he did. And then he turns up into F1 in the worst McLaren that McLaren have ever produced, with Fernando Alonso as a teammate, and everybody was surprised that he got absolutely obliterated. And I just don't think that was the final form, or even the starting form, of what Stoffel Vandoorne could have been. And if there was more teams, I'm certain there are other teams that would have taken him.
So just a couple of things before we do move on to our kind of our history with Alex and Brad. Tom and Connor both mentioned that the Virgin team actually didn't even have big enough fuel tanks to finish the race. I remember that. That's a bit of an oversight, isn't it? That's not being able to physically get to the end of the races. That's going to hamper your points tally. Deborah Hood, I didn't see the super chat pop up, but I'm going to believe her. Deborah says, are cars easier to drive now than in 2010? Well, Alex, as we're both experienced Formula One drivers who have experience of both of those generations of cars, I'm going to say the cars now are harder to drive.
From a physical point of view, I'd say.
Yeah, physically harder than in 2010. They're faster, and they are certainly this current generation that we began with last season are very peaky, really bad in low-speed corners, and need extreme commitment in the high-speed corners because they're very good at going through high-speed corners. So I reckon they're probably one of the hardest types of car to drive. Plus, they're bigger, they're wider, they're a larger car, so there's less room to maneuver them around a track. So I'm going to say they're harder now than they were in 2010. That doesn't mean they're the hardest ever, though.
I also think there's a harder mental load as well, because there's so many buttons and switches and things that they change corner to corner, let alone lap to lap, that they have to be able to drive the car at maximum pace all the time while making lots of button switches and different things like that. And that, I think, is completely understated by everything in F1. The media and F1 have this habit of doing this. They don't make anywhere near as enough of a fuss about how amazing these engines are, how efficient these engines are, the power they produce, how clean they actually are. They don't make any reference to how difficult it is to drive an F1 car when you get people who just go, oh, well, they've got power steering, so it's easier. Yeah, you try and turn a car that weighs as much as an F1 car does with 4G going through the corners, 5G going through the corners. You try and turn it without power steering.
We've had this conversation ourselves many, many times, but just a member of the public trying to drive a Formula 4 car at anywhere approaching, within 15 seconds of a good lap time, physically, I don't think most people are remotely capable of doing that. And Formula 1 is obviously on another level. One last thing, again, before we move on to the history, is how did we forget Jules Bianchi? Yeah. Jules Bianchi obviously drove in, I guess it would have been Marussia at the time. I don't think he was in the first season of those. Yeah, so... Anyway, guys, thanks for your questions and comments so far. Sorry, Alex, you've got one more thing?
With regards to also how difficult the F1 car is to drive. Now, some people get annoyed when we talk about sim racing, but iRacing released the W12 on iRacing last year. No, 2020 at the end of 2021. And the amount of people who drove that car said it was easy to drive because it's got lots and lots of grip. But what they miss out is the physicality. But the thing that also lots of people said is the car was so fast that they couldn't think fast enough to drive it quickly. So by the time they think about braking, they're past the braking point. By the time they think about turning, they're past the turning point. So if you're struggling to drive the car in a simulator, especially when it has as much grip as it's got, because you can't think fast enough, then think about doing that while you're doing those kind of speeds in the real world with your own fear of safety and going around a corner at 200 miles an hour. It really, really adds up, and I just think there are a lot of people out there who just do not appreciate how difficult though driving these things now must be.
Driving race cars is difficult. Shall we do history with Alex and Brad?
Let's do it.
Our regular segment where we get to show how old we are because we remember things from the distant past. So this one is the story of the I was going to say stillborn Lola team, but they were born. They just died shortly afterwards. This did not go well for this team, and it's actually worse than it sounds. So Lola were a race car manufacturer for many, many years, and they helped and supported Formula One teams over those years. And we're talking kind of decades, like back to the 60s. And they were always considered pretty good. They knew what they were doing. They were an expert race car builder, much in the way that you see Dallara nowadays. And obviously they made sports cars, all sorts of different well-known race cars. I could show you a big sheet full of images of race cars that you would recognise, and they would be Lolas. Now, they decided to enter Formula One, finally, having dabbled and kind of toyed with the idea for many years before. They entered as a full manufacturer in 1997. They decided to do this in 1996, and the plan was to enter in 1998. But they secured a big money sponsor, and that was something a sponsor you'll all have heard of, which was MasterCard. So they secured this sponsor, and they had a lot of pressure from MasterCard to enter sooner rather than later. And that's because MasterCard wanted to launch their Formula One club. Have you ever heard of this, Alex? And do you recognise the car? So when I put up this image, those of you on YouTube will see the picture of the blue, red, white and orange MasterCard Lola.
I have vague recollections of that ugly livery, but I have, ever since you mentioned this to me, I think the other day that you were going to talk about this, and I purposely haven't researched it so I can learn along with everybody else. I've been racking my brain and I remember nothing of this. So
there's a really good reason.
On this.
There's a really good reason why you might not recognise it, because you won't have seen it much at the races. So anyway, before we get to the first race, MasterCard's idea to sponsor this team, the way this funding was designed was that people who were signing up for MasterCard would sign up to a special F1 version of it, and a portion of the funds from signing up to that would go to the race team. They'd go to Lola, and that would pay for the sponsorship. So Lola probably unwisely forewent an actual cash sponsorship deal, instead going for the promise of funds that would come from people seeing these race cars go around with MasterCard written on the side. They would sign up to a MasterCard and they would choose a specific Lola Formula One MasterCard, and then Lola would get a cut of that. Now, the sales of this card, or the take-up of this card, were really bad. I mean, like a fraction of what they'd hoped for. So straight away, there was not much funding. Allied to that, they were supposed to come in with their own power unit, a kind of in-house factory-built power unit. Wasn't ready in time, so they had to go for a kind of less powerful Ford, which wasn't a very good engine, a V8. So that they're not good things. You know, it's already not looking like a great project. The funding's not quite there. They had two pretty inexperienced drivers. They had Vincenzo Sospiri, and they also had, who was their other driver? He was Formula 3000, which is effectively Formula 2 champion, Riccardo Rosset. So decent.
I remember him. The other
decent.
guy I've never heard of, but I remember Riccardo Rosset. He wasn't very good. From my memory of history, him in F1 was never very good.
Very inexperienced driver. You know, they hadn't gone in with two really well-known pros. Anyway, the car never saw a wind tunnel. Not a good way to design a Formula One car. And this isn't, it never saw a wind tunnel, but it was designed entirely with CFD. We're talking Windows 95.
They didn't have CFD back then.
Certainly nothing to speak of that would have been worth using.
I don't know how you would design a Formula One car without a wind tunnel back in those days and make it, because it was high aero. We're only talking 1997, so it was high aero dependency. So how you can design anything on a Formula One car without the use of a wind tunnel blows my mind.
So, Alex, they could have done with you and your advice back then. You might have been able to talk some sense into the management. However, optimistically, they arrived at Melbourne for the first race, and the cars, fortunately, were actually really fast. Nope, I'm talking rubbish. They were 11 seconds off the pace. They were slower than their Formula 3000 car, than their equivalent Formula 2 car of nowadays. And they were well outside the 107% rule time to make it onto the grid. So, and Kevin O'Toole in the chat suggesting maybe they designed it on paint, Windows Paint. Anyway, I thought the car looked quite cool. The livery was quite cool, but they were not selling many MasterCards off the basis of that first race. But don't worry, because they headed to Brazil for round 2. All the staff went there, and off they went to Sao Paulo and never turned a wheel. The team was wound up, and not only that, the entire company, not just the Formula One team, the Lola company, which was such a successful race car builder, was entirely bankrupt and had to be wound up because of that failed project. Just such an unfortunate and ill-fated attempt at Formula One that a successful race car builder with what should be decent backing from a big money sponsor attempts it, and then not only is rubbish, not only is slow, doesn't make it past the first race, never races, by the way. They didn't qualify for Melbourne, so they never entered the actual race. All the staff went for a nice holiday in Brazil and then never even went out for practice, and that was it. The car, everything was kind of wound up, and the drivers were... Ricardo Rosset did find a drive. I think that was Sosbury's last ever event, though, in Formula.
And we say HRT was bad.
Yeah, exactly.
At least HRT completed a couple of seasons. Again, Connor in the website said apparently Rosset was hated so much by the team when he was at Tyrrell in 1998. They swapped around the R in Rosset and the T to make it a rude word. Which
you're allowed to say rude words.
I was going to say, which is toss it, which actually isn't that rude, but it's funny.
No, it's tosser because they swapped the R and the T. It's the second thing.
Sorry, I'm going mad. Yes, R and the T. So yeah, they got him a tosser. So yeah, he didn't have much of an F1 career.
And at least he got to drive again, but Sosbury never did. Well, certainly not in Formula One. I don't know what his career outside of Formula One was.
Flipping
so
burgers.
That's the dangers of a new team entering. But can you really see Andretti coming in with a manufacturer and time to do it properly, and all the planning and preparation and know-how they've got, and have even a remotely similar outcome to that? Because I can't. I think we're talking about quite different things.
I think, and the FIA president, I'm not going to attempt to say his name. I've heard his name a whole bunch of times over the last couple of weeks, and I still can't pronounce his name. So I'm not even going to try. The FIA president has basically told the teams to bugger off. Stop getting involved. It's not your call. And we are looking into allowing new teams. Now, that isn't a promise of we're going to allow a new team in. That is, they are looking at the options. So don't get that twisted. But I very much believe if Andretti are going to come into the sport, they are going to do it properly. The thing that has been mentioned is, but obviously they'll have a factory in America and there'll be an American-based team, which takes away from the hub of basically Oxfordshire. Of where F1 is based and where all the people in F1 live, and that's why places like teams like AlphaTauri find it difficult because they've got to go to Switzerland and things like that. However,
Faenza.
Faenza. Who's? Oh, sorry, Sauber's in Sauber Alfa Romeo is in Switzerland, but there's a big difference between getting your family to move to a remote part of Italy or a remote part of Switzerland to moving to America. I think there is a lot of prospects where if you offer enough money, and I don't think money is going to be an issue for them, to go, hey, really good designer of engines, hey, really good aero person, hey, really good team manager, come live in this nice place in America where it's always hot and sunny, and we'll give you the American dream and all the stuff you want for your kids. I think it is a draw, especially for a lot of the young upcoming guys in the engineering departments at places like that. I think they'll revel in the opportunity to go work for a big team in America.
So I think you're actually underselling the American, or kind of maybe not even doing justice to the talent of race teams and personnel in America. I think there's a big motorsport community and it's a very big country. So I don't even think you need to attract current F1 personnel, certainly not most of the team. I think when you're an Andretti and you've got all of your IndyCar contacts to pull from, and obviously NASCAR and all the other motorsport industry out in America, there's a lot of racing expertise and know-how out there. I think they could probably just go with even fully American staff. But you're right, it's always difficult for teams historically to attract good staff if they're based anywhere else. Andretti's a special case, but based in further flung places that aren't the UK, basically in this area where I am right now, where all the race teams are within an hour. And that's why Haas have a base in Banbury. The car factory where the car is built, I believe, is still in Banbury, even though it's not designed there and the parts aren't manufactured there. That's where everything comes, because that's where the race team itself are based.
I'm going to be driving past that factory in a week or two for a meeting. Going to go to Roger's Cafe round the corner from the factory.
It's Reg's Caf, actually, and it's not a burger van. It's got tables and chairs, as the advert on the radio says.
It does.
It's the best. I love that.
We
heard.
We were going to go for the breakfast, but they've changed it to a Miller and Carter now, so we can't go there.
Okay. And Ben Williamson in the chat says, so why do Haas have a European arm then? I think that's because for their concept, where the car was being manufactured by Dallara, which is Italian, and they didn't maybe have such a... Formula One, when Haas was announced and when the team was originally built, it wasn't as big as it is in America now, and it just wasn't the same. I know it was quite recent, but it wasn't exactly the same sport as we've got now in 2023. I think it's more realistic with the Americanization of it to draw people to an American team, but we will see. We'll see even if they get a spot. I guess probably one of the last things we should talk about before we run out of things to talk about is, are there any other teams? We've spoken a lot about Andretti. Are there any other teams you can see coming in as one of these new ones? Is there any other teams that might put forward their proposal?
Well, up until a couple of months ago, we would have said Porsche, but they well and truly backed out of the Red Bull deal at the final hour. Almost. I think pen was about to be put to paper and they pulled out. Maybe because it was just around the time when Red Bull got proved of cheating and got all their massive fine, and maybe they didn't want to be associated with such a nefarious outfit. But I'd love to see Porsche come in. I don't think they will now. I think with Audi coming in, I think that's one part of the VAG group in F1, and that is going to be enough. The problem is the VAG group owns so many high performance cars because they also own someone like Lamborghini and things like that. But no, I don't think there's anyone else at the moment who has a proper, valid effort that can be fully funded. There are probably plenty of teams who can scrape in, but whether they can stay, I don't know.
So I've got a couple that I'd like to throw into the ring. One in particular, and I think this is the kind of team that Formula One are most interested in. Manufacturer teams that have a lot of clout and finance behind them that can properly, really come in properly and do the job without just fizzling out. And that is Hyundai, or hang on, how do you say it in American? We might have American listeners.
Hyundai.
Hyundai. How did
Hyundai.
Anyway, Hyundai, they have a full, from the ground up, from scratch, built World Rally team. They have recently had Cyril Abiteboul appointed as head of motorsport, who has a lot of Formula One experience. And I believe, Hyundai, we're being told in the chat, I believe he has his eyes on coming back for revenge against Horner in Formula One. And I actually think, genuinely, that's the kind of company that might throw its weight behind a Formula One project.
That would be really interesting. I'd love that.
I will probably be proven wrong, but I think they could be.
I mean, I'd love for Toyota to come back. I'd love for BMW to come back, because I do think the sport needs big names to validate it. And, if someone just comes in as Bob's F1 team, no one's going to be that super excited. I mean, the one person who could start their own team. He's certainly got enough money, and he certainly pisses enough people off that no team's going to want him. Could be Fernando Alonso. He'd come in as owner, team principal, top strategist, top aerodynamicist, and number one driver, and probably still get an argument with himself and kick himself out of his own team.
So another much less likely entrant could be currently not allowed because of the war in Ukraine, but the Russian team from our friend that was unceremoniously dropped by Haas recently. What's his name?
I was about to say Sirotkin. It's not Sirotkin.
Could you tell? I was like, hang on, I'm going to remember it in a minute. If I just talk about it for long enough.
I just remember his face. He looks like a generic computer game character.
Wait, there was like a joke.
Ben Williamson in the team.
Yeah, I was thinking, wait, there's a joke about spin. It must be something spin. Mazepin. So the Mazepins are connected to the High-Tech junior team. So High-Tech is a team that's throughout junior single-seaters. They're really well respected. And it's a team that both Nikita and his younger brother drove for. And I don't know whether his younger brother still is driving with High-Tech, but I heard this on another podcast. And in fact, I'll credit them. It's The Race. The Race are an excellent podcast, and they often have little scoops like this and some very good insider knowledge. And I heard, I believe, Scott Mitchell-Malm talking about High-Tech had registered the name High-Tech GP, or maybe something similar, or something like Racing GP 26, something which alluded to the fact that they were looking at a 2026 Formula One entry with the backing of the Mazepin money. So I don't believe they're allowed in with that nationality at the moment, but that's another, on the fringes, probably unrealistic, but certainly with the funding to maybe end.
If we're talking about unrealistic ones that could just be an absolute dumpster fire, your mate Bill Story at Rich Energy.
Why my mate? Oh, hang on. Did he reply to a tweet?
You had a Twitter. I swear you had a bit of a Twitter spat with him, didn't you?
Probably because he's into all
Twitter
sorts
spat with a lot of people. To be fair,
it will definitely have been because he was anti-science, vaccine denying, COVID denying, probably flat earther. He's all that wrapped up in one. Allegedly. Hang on, I should probably say that because this is actually a podcast now. So
he probably would sue us. I mean, if he knows who we are, he knows there's no point suing us. But
well, anyway, yes, I think I probably had a disagreement with him, but I don't think we're going to see, despite them claiming it every year, I don't think we're going to see a Rich Energy F1 team anytime soon.
I think he's just dying to sponsor something, to get his name out there and to be in the paddock. And especially now that you don't have to be vaccinated to be in the paddock now.
Fun fact, he sponsored the BTCC car that I raced, but not when I raced it. So a season or two afterwards, he sponsored that. I saw Rich Energy on the door of that. Anyway, let's not advertise them anymore. Alex, do you have any more news items from the last week that you'd like to touch upon? It's quite a slow news week.
It has been a very slow news week. There was quite a lot last week, and we had some good fun with teams and stuff last week. But no, there's not really much else going on with regards to F1. Hopefully there is some more news next week. Otherwise, we're going to have to do a very long story on something to do with history with Brad and Alex.
I do enjoy the history stories, but I'm going to really, really enjoy sinking my teeth into launch season and all the speculation about that when that starts up soon.
Yeah, I'm trying to get excited about launch season, but I'm just terrified launch season is just going to be a bunch of livery launches. And I hope I'm proved wrong. And some people have gone, actually, our design from last year was rubbish, so let's redesign the whole car. But I don't think it's going to happen. The most interesting thing I think will be to see from the launches is if the rumours are true that Mercedes have stuck with the zero side pod design.
Okay, well, I I don't think that's interesting. I think that's even more boring if they've stuck with that, because we won't have anything concrete at all to talk about regarding Mercedes. I do have a slight Mercedes related thing that I'm going to take credit for. You might have seen the new Lewis Hamilton Monster Energy drinks that are out, the new blue ones.
I can't believe you are trying to take credit for this, but I'll let you tell the story.
I'm going to take credit for this because I noticed last year that the Lewis Hamilton Monster Energy drinks, not that I was buying them, I don't think they were even sugar-free. But
No, his ones have always been sugar-free. He had the red one that I haven't been able to, which I was always looking for because I actually liked that one, regardless of the fact that it was Lewis Hamilton's. And I haven't been able to find that in over a year.
Well, anyway, sat bored at an airport, I read the back of it, and it said, when you're a 3-time world champion like Lewis Hamilton, you need blah, blah, blah. And I just, very bored, I know this is really lame, so everyone listening, yes, I'm lame.
This is how sad Bradley Philpot actually is.
Wouldn't it be funny if I wrote to them, told them that was out of date, but actually tricked them into writing 8-time world champion on the next one because they might not pay attention? So I just sent them on like their contact form that was on the back of the can. Just letting you know, this is a bit out of date now. You might just want to consider updating this, considering he's now an 8-time world champion. Obviously, I know he's not. And then, 2 months later, they actually update the can. So there we go. Very tasty. So that's that.
I actually have a photo, and I will stick it on Twitter, of my youngest child walking through Asda. Lauren, my wife, pointed out that Lewis Hamilton was on this thing with his new drink on it, and she went up and gave shouted Lewis Hamilton and went up and gave him a hug.
Wow, your kids are lame. You brought up lame kids. We should probably promote the fact you've been posting TikToks from this show. Is that on do we have an account? Do we have a full chat account?
It's on my account. It's on my account for now. As with everything at the moment, is because full chat is new and we both have followerships on other stuff. If we just make a full chat one, it doesn't quite go there. So we do have a full chat Twitter. So please go and follow that. It's at fullchatf1. So go and follow that. I posted a video of a 2 minute and 20-second rundown of our hour-long conversation about what drivers are going to do next year. That was really difficult to do, so please go and watch it on TikTok at Alex Van Gene. Give it a like, give me a follow, because it's got about 600 views, and it really deserves more than that for the amount of effort that I had to put into that. I'm also taking part in the Daytona 24-hour sim race in a couple of weeks.
Boo, no one cares.
Only because you've got an event going on that day as well. But yeah, so it's me, Missed Apex's Kyle Power, TikTok and YouTube sensation Stuffy, Danny Henney and Sam Swallow, all racing the new BMW LMDH at Daytona in the 24 hours. I will be streaming it, Stuffy will be streaming it, and it should be a lot of fun as long as we make it past the first stint without getting wiped out by a GT3 car.
And with that, our viewer and listener numbers dropped off a cliff because no one cares. Someone in the chat there has asked, Connor's asked, did Alex win the football? Alex, as you rightly know, Connor, does football on Wednesday night. So you'll have to wait until next week to find out whether he wins tomorrow. But did you win yesterday? No, hang on, tomorrow. No, last Wednesday. You know what I mean.
Didn't play last Wednesday. I'm actually got my first game tomorrow. So I will fill you in on how badly I do, because ever since the Christmas break kicked in, my diet stopped and all my activity stopped. So I'm kind of back to square one.
What's your team?
It's not a team. We're not a team. It's just 10 mid-30s, early 40s dads who go play football on Wednesday night and kick a ball around and try not to hurt each other.
Okay, well, in the final wrap-up then, remember to follow me at Bradley Philpot on Twitter. If you're on the Twitter space, you probably already do that. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to this channel. And like we do TikTok on your channel, we do the YouTube on mine. And obviously, the real thing we want to push is go and subscribe to our podcast on your podcatcher of choice. Make Alex happy when he's refreshing constantly all through the next few days, and give us a few listens and subscribers on the podcast. And until next week, guys, remember, on the straight bits at least, you should always be full chat. Did that one work? I'm trying new ones. Nobody sent me in a better full chat outro line.
Well, there we go. There's one for the chat, and there's one for our Twitters. Send us what you think our outro line should be. And we will, if we like it, we will use it forever and credit you, but you won't get any royalties.
because we've literally got nothing better. But guys, thanks for watching, listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.